69 movie review. So this is a review of the Japanese movie 69, which came out, actually I forget exactly, I think it came out around 2000, mid-2000s. I was actually living in Japan at the time, and actually let me back up. The movie is called 69 because it takes place in the year 1969 and is kind of, among other things, about kind of the protests going on in Japan in the 60s. I was actually living in Japan when this movie came out, and the Japanese student movement, student protests in the 1960s, have long been a historical interest of mine. So I was interested in this movie, but I didn't actually see it at the time, largely because I read a review of it in the Japan Times that was very critical. The Japan Times is one of the English language newspapers in Japan. The reviewer of the movie said kind of essentially, isn't this so typical? He said, I lived through the 60s. I remember protesting. We were really serious back then. He says, what this movie does is it just kind of takes that and it makes it into kind of a frivolous boy meets girl story. And he says this is kind of what the Japanese film industry or Japanese media has been doing in general, which is to kind of gloss over the politics that happened during the 1960s and kind of depoliticize it. And I read the review and I thought, yeah, that sounds about right, because there was actually, when I lived in Japan, there was actually the Japanese media had largely kind of forgotten about the politics of the student movement in the 1960s. That's true in a lot of countries, but it was particularly true in Japan. Whereas people, a number of Japanese friends my age, didn't even know that there had been a protest movement in Japan in the 1960s. I mean, people in America might not really care that much, but people in America kind of at least know that there had been kind of hippies and protests in the 1960s. I mean, that everybody kind of knows. In Japan, it's gotten kind of so little coverage by the Japanese media and kind of is so little talked about in Japanese schools that people who lived through it know, but people who didn't live through it had no idea. So I gave the movie a pass. But actually, since then, I've read the book on which it is based from by Ryo Murakami. Yeah, it's an interesting book. I've actually reviewed that separately on this channel, 69 by Ryo Murakami. But just to recap briefly, it's apparently, as far as I can tell, a mostly true memoir of the year 1969, kind of Romanak Clef, I think. He changes all the names, but it's mostly true. So the young Ryo Murakami is a high school student in the countryside of Kyushu. I also lived in Kyushu during my time in Japan, not in the same province, but kind of the same island. So he's all the way out in the boondocks. So he's aware that something revolutionary is happening in the big cities of Tokyo, but he's just really far away from all that. He reads Camus and kind of other counterculture books, and he sees the large protests on TV, and he wants in, but he isn't sure how. I mean, he's all the way out kind of as a high school student in this small town in Kyushu. He uses the Vietnam War as a way to try to get the moral high ground over his teachers. He and his classmates sneak into the school at night and paint it with revolutionary slogans. And he tries to organize a rock festival in his town. His politics are muddled, and much of what he does is more to get the attention of a girl than out of true revolutionary conviction. So as a political manifesto, you could criticize this every which way, but as a memoir of what it was like to be 17 years old in 1969 in Kyushu in Japan, I thought it was an authentic story. Now, the movie, jumping from the book to the movie takes a lot of liberties with the book. But the essential plot elements are all there, as well as much of the ironic humor. The filmmakers, however, were unable to resist adding a few kind of classic movie stuff. For example, in the movie, there's a final confrontation with the PE teacher. In both the book and the movie, the PE teacher is kind of the bad guy. He kind of terrorizes the young Murakami. In the book, there's no dramatic confrontation at the ending. But in the movie, they add in this dramatic final scene with the PE teacher. But that's the movies for you. Actually, the movie adds in a lot more scenes for dramatic effects. At various points, the protagonists in the movie manage to offend and then get chased down by the police. In another scene, the U.S. Army. Another scene, kind of Japanese college-age militant students. None of these scenes were in the book, and all of these scenes kind of take the tone of the movie up a notch. But that's the movies, huh? Also, yeah, another difference between Japanese films and American movies is kind of the subtlety of the acting, or lack thereof. Japanese films have a lot of overacting in them. This movie also has a fair degree of overacting. But on the whole, I enjoyed it, and as a comedy, I thought it was a success. I don't usually consider myself a fan of Japanese comedies. The humor doesn't always translate well. But this one had me genuinely laughing at points. There were some good laugh out loud moments in this movie. So yeah, if you're looking for a fun film, I think you can't go wrong with this one.